Obesity is often seen through the narrow lens of caloric balance, how much we eat versus how much we burn. But that model, while foundational, fails to explain why some people gain weight more easily than others even with similar diets and activity levels. A deeper and more biologically nuanced explanation lies in the role of chronic, low-grade inflammation, a silent disruptor of metabolism that can nudge the body toward fat storage, insulin resistance, and hormonal imbalances, all without requiring dramatic overeating. Inflammation is not just a byproduct of obesity, it can be a driver of it, particularly when triggered by persistent stress, poor sleep, environmental toxins, or underlying illness. Inflammation, in its acute form, is a vital immune response that helps the body fight infection and repair injury. But when this response becomes chronic, due to psychological stress, disrupted circadian rhythms, processed diets, pollution, or even loneliness, it turns destructive. Low-grade inflammation activates immune pathways that interfere with insulin signaling, shift how fat cells behave, and even impair how energy is utilized at the cellular level. This form of inflammation doesn't cause obvious symptoms, which is why it's often overlooked. Yet it can subtly reshape how the body handles food, increasing fat deposition even when caloric intake isn't excessive. One of the key mechanisms at play involves the hormone insulin. Chronic inflammation makes tissues less responsive to insulin, a condition known as insulin resistance. As a result, the body produces more insulin to compensate. High insulin levels, in turn, signal the body to store more energy as fat, particularly in the abdominal region. This creates a vicious cycle. More fat leads to more inflammation, and more inflammation leads to more fat accumulation. Even diets that are moderate in calories may lead to weight gain under these conditions because the body is primed to store rather than burn. Stress is a major contributor to this process. Chronic psychological stress activates the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal (HPA) axis, flooding the body with cortisol. This hormone not only increases appetite, particularly for high-sugar, high-fat foods, but also promotes fat storage, especially around the belly. Stress-related inflammation also disrupts sleep patterns, further compounding metabolic dysregulation. When sleep is poor, inflammatory cytokines such as IL-6 and TNF-alpha increase, while hormones like leptin and ghrelin, which regulate appetite, become unbalanced, driving hunger and reducing the ability to feel full. Environmental exposures also play a surprisingly powerful role. Air pollution, endocrine-disrupting chemicals in plastics and personal care products, and even ultra-processed food additives can all provoke an inflammatory response. These so-called obesogens interfere with hormonal signaling and fat cell development, potentially leading to weight gain independent of diet. People living in polluted urban areas, for example, often have higher baseline inflammatory markers and a greater risk of obesity-related diseases, even if their lifestyles appear similar to those in cleaner environments. Another critical factor is gut health. A disrupted microbiome can trigger systemic inflammation by allowing small amounts of bacteria or toxins to enter the bloodstream, a condition known as leaky gut. This can activate the immune system and set off a cascade of inflammatory responses that affect not only digestion but also mood, insulin sensitivity, and appetite regulation. In this way, gut inflammation becomes both a metabolic and behavioral problem, influencing food choices and how calories are metabolized. What makes inflammation particularly dangerous in the context of obesity is that it's often invisible. A person can be eating relatively well, exercising sporadically, and still struggle with stubborn weight gain, unaware that their body is in a persistent state of low-level immune activation. They may blame themselves or turn to increasingly restrictive diets, which can further stress the body, perpetuating the cycle. Weight gain under these conditions isn't just a matter of discipline, it's a biological response to an overwhelmed system. The solution is not just about lowering calories, it's about lowering inflammation. That means improving sleep hygiene, reducing stress through mindfulness or social connection, minimizing exposure to toxins, and increasing anti-inflammatory foods such as fatty fish, leafy greens, berries, nuts, olive oil, and fermented foods. Regular movement also acts as an anti-inflammatory intervention, not just by burning calories, but by reducing cytokine production and enhancing immune regulation. It also requires a more compassionate view of weight. Not all bodies respond the same way to diet and exercise, especially when the inflammatory burden is high. For many, focusing on metabolic health, reducing blood pressure, improving sleep, regulating blood sugar may be more productive and sustainable than chasing an ideal weight. And for public health systems, addressing systemic contributors to inflammation such as pollution, economic stress, and food insecurity will be essential if long-term obesity trends are to be reversed. In the end, chronic inflammation reframes obesity as more than a willpower issue. It is a biological process deeply intertwined with the environment, lifestyle, and internal regulation systems. Until that complexity is fully appreciated, efforts to control weight through food alone will continue to fall short. Not because people are failing, but because the problem runs deeper than calories can measure.